This is a thank you to everyone who's subscribed to this channel and anyone who leaves a like or a comment on these videos. It really helps. And to anyone who's not subscribed, consider subscribing for more videos like this. One night in the early 80s, a young man burst through the doors of a police station in Moss Side, Manchester. He was frantic with fear. "Some men are coming with machetes," he shouted. "They're going to chop me up." The desk officer flattened a buzzer, and within seconds bobbies were pulling on their jackets and running outside. They peered into the damp night. There was no one around. Whoever was doing the chasing had vanished. Back in the security of the station, the agitated young man, brown-skinned, of mixed race, slowly calmed down. The bobbies joked that he must have been seeing things, but they could tell he was not scared. In the climate of the times, such incidents were not unknown. Recent weeks had seen a rising number of street woundings on the Moss, many with machete, the favourite weapon of the area's West Indian immigrants. Local bobbies put it down to individual disputes that had just become a bit more intense than usual. The young man wasn't first to dash into the nick for protection that night, and he wouldn't be the last. Though it was now 1 o'clock in the morning, 2 senior detectives were called in to interview him. They sat him down, gave him a cup of tea, and asked the usual questions, and got the usual answers. Nothing. Yet, there was something about the demeanour of the young man that hinted he had something to say. The 2 officers, a detective chief inspector and a sergeant, made sure he got home safely, and a couple of weeks later paid him a follow-up visit. Then something unusual happened, something that would write the first page of the story in the Manchester gang wars. The young man began to talk. The story he told astounded the hard-bitten detectives. The city, he said, was being carved up by 2 black gangs. One was from Moss Side itself, an area a mile south of the city centre, and could call upon up to 80 young men, though most of these were bit players. The hardcore were involved in armed robbery, drug dealing, pimping and thieving. The other gang was based in Cheetham Hill, a couple of miles north of the city centre, and in particular on a couple of modern but already run-down council estates. The core members of the Cheetham Hill mob had graduated from the street crime and petty theft to high-level robberies, favouring raids on security vans making payroll deliveries. They were well organised, with strong leaders, and the young man claimed could put up to 130 soldiers onto the streets. Many gang members on both sides knew each other well, and some were friends. Much of the black population of Cheetham had been moved from Moss Side during the slum clearances in the 60s, and maintained family ties in the area. Others knew each other from their early teenage years, hanging around the indoor Arndale shopping centre, a popular meeting place for some of the more unruly black teenagers. It had seemed sensible for the leading figures on both sides to form a loose alliance, agreeing not to carry out robberies on each other's turf, and this was what they had done. The more senior of the 2 detectives, the DCI, listened with scepticism. Though he had transferred only recently to the Moss Side from nearby Longsight, his father had been a Moss Side cop 25 years earlier, and he knew the area and its people. This tale didn't tally with any of his assumptions. The informant said the robbers got together and said, "This town isn't big enough for this." So they coordinated their activities, recalled the DCI. There was an alliance and a division of territory. They controlled the prostitution, the robberies, the drugs and the tax activities. They were well structured. Something, however, then caused the 2 sides to fall out. It started with a robbery close to the BBC building on Oxford Road, on a cash-in-transit van, said the DCI. One side was hitting on the ground of the other and refused to pay tax. This was followed by a series of woundings on the street and that was when the fellow ran into the police station seeking sanctuary. Though the officers had hid their disbelief, it sounded like he was spinning them a yarn. How could this have been happening without their knowledge? The numbers involved for a start seemed implausible. It was also unlikely that any young group could control the crime in an area as unruly as Moss Side. The older guys would not have stood for it. It came right out of the blue. There was no perception of organisation until then, and at first it was assumed the informant was gilding the lily. Before, we just thought it was disorganised. Yet, the young man was adamant, and there had been all those machete attacks. Manchester had also been plagued by a spate of violent armed robberies, many of them in Cheetham Hill. A Cheetham sub-post office was relieved of £10,000 in January 1983 when men with shotguns forced staff and customers to lie face down and rifled the safe. A month later, a balaclava-clad gang struck two guards with pickaxe handles and took £20,000 outside a Cheetham cash and carry. Then, a security guard was shot in the shoulder outside Barclays Bank in Cheetham Hill Road. The gang escaped in style in a stolen Porsche. These were heavy-duty jobs, and the informant continued. The detectives' ingrained cynicism gave way to growing excitement. Perhaps they were onto something big. Their next problem was to convince their boss. The DCI reported this to his chief superintendent, Frank Halligan, a vastly experienced officer who also knew Moss Side inside and out. As a detective, he had led the investigations into the riots there in 1981. Halligan was even more sceptical. He was most familiar with the Moss Side underworld of the 60s and 70s, with its shebeens and illicit blues clubs, its gambling dens and raucous card schools, its genial Jamaican dope dealers and exotic madams. The idea that young gangs were vying for control of the rackets was a new one to him and frankly sounded ludicrous. When I put the report in, Halligan simply didn't believe it, said the DCI. Moss Side is a flat expanse of housing a mile south of Manchester city centre, split into two parts by Princess Road, now Princess Parkway. Old Moss Side, largely constructed before the First World War in a grid pattern of back-to-back houses, is in the eastern part. On the western side, new Moss Side is the Alexandra Park estate of mainly terraced housing built in the 1970s to a peculiar layout that restricts traffic flows into many of the streets by means of cul-de-sacs and walkways. As a whole, Moss Side is home to around 14,500 people, an unusually high proportion of them young. Almost 45% are under the 25, and there are 4 times more single-parent families than the national average. While many are Irish, Asians, students, or born and bred Mancunians, it is the 40% of Afro-Caribbean descent that most influence the district's character. For all the stereotypes of indolent, come and go, day Caribbeans that many white cops believed, most of the original black immigrants work hard, some holding down several jobs, and the ghetto, though little wild, was not unwelcoming to the police. Even those who broke the law often did so for cultural rather than criminal reasons. When the immigrants came over, a lot came off sugar plantations and had certain skills to manufacture liquor, said Frank Halligan, who would eventually command the CID Central Division covering Manchester and Salford. They knew all about running stills and shebeens. They had a culture where they didn't get married. They had very loose relationships. They were all big, strong lads, and they smoked cannabis. They even used to give it to their kids for coughs. It's part of their culture. In those days, prostitution was the big money maker. You would get people running a number of prostitutes, and someone would try to muscle in, and you would get the odd shooting with shotguns. But mostly it was the machete. It comes from the plantations, and they all carried knives. Until then, the drug scene started to develop. Manchester University is right next door, and middle-class kids were going in buying cannabis. You didn't really see heroin. The whole of that part of Manchester ran on vice, shebeens and brothels. You didn't get that in Hume next door, which was mainly white and terraced houses, where there were a few very hard men like Scotch Dave and a few car dealers. They would have links to the city and they would defend their territory with guns. Poverty was unconcealed. There were children without shoes in the middle of winter, in just a vest and trousers. The police would collect money and distribute it to the poor. It was a mature population of immigrants who had come here as adults, and there wasn't a great racism problem. The police by and large got on with them very well. The problems occurred with the offspring of that generation. Not just the police, but the parents had problems with them. Illegal drinking dens, known as shebeens, were the arteries of Mossad social life, where men gathered in bare-roomed walls to play cards, smoke and listen to music, drink red stripe and eat goat curry. Certain major players ran Mossad, and they definitely weren't community leaders, said Halligan. Running clubs were men like Scarface Shine, Pereira and Tunde. Salo Sabe ran the Nile. He was very influential. There was a coloured lady called Mary Robinson who was very well known, ran shebeens, a great person. People could go to her with all kinds of problems. Robinson had a wooden chute out the back of the window, down which booze and customers would slide if police raided through the front. The shebeens were very useful for the police. The people who ran them didn't want trouble inside because when they would get shut down, and there were very good sources of information, the criminals and the prostitutes would go in there. If we got a bad spate of robberies that we wouldn't connect up, you would go in there and they would be openly boasting. In the late 60s, the city embarked on a massive program of slum clearance, flattening many of the old back-to-backs in Mossad and Hume to build grey, featureless, high and mid-rise flats. Residents were mowed out to Cheetham Hill and to overspill estates in Hyde and Hattersley while the work was carried out. They made the classic mistake of building high-rise flats, said Halligan. What they did with Hume was devastating. There were certain structures holding it together, families that knew each other, but they moved out a lot. They used to come back for years to the pubs in Hume, even when they lived miles away. The notorious Hume Crescents, huge semicircular blocks of mid-rise flats with thin walls, urine-soaked stairwells and rubbish-strewn balconies, became the most notorious symbol of the rebuild. The Crescents were built on the architecture of Bath, but they had small ginnels and were havens for crime. Decent people would feel very isolated. There were open grass areas in the middle with dogs running around and prostitutes street walking. The whole place started to go down. This was not Bath. The drab uniformity of the brutalist architecture sapped the soul from the area, and rising unemployment deepened the malaise. In parts of Mossad, 4 out of every 5 young black people had no job by the early 80s. Employers were routinely accused of post-code prejudice against the district. Add to that the racial tensions, the rise of the National Front in the late 70s, and the growing black consciousness inspired by the Rastafarianism of reggae idols such as Bob Marley, and a chill wind was rising. Many shebeens survived the clearances, while others appeared in the new Hume flats. They remained an important source of intelligence, and detectives could still move freely in them, but the owners sometimes put minders on their shoulders, and occasionally the young bucks would smash their car windows while they were inside. Many of the children of the hard-working first-generation immigrants were in no mood to accept the cultural norms of white society that seemed to offer them little. The open smoking of ganja was no longer a tradition but 2 fingers up to the authority. Stop us if you dare. Afros were pulled into dreadlocks. The Mossad Frank Halligan knew was passing. The riot sounded its death knell. For several nights, Toxteth in Liverpool had been consumed by an orgy of violence, so it was not entirely a surprise when in the early hours of the 8th of July 1981, a group of youths left the Nile Club and attacked the shops along Princess Road. Daylight saw crowds gather on the stretch of grass separating the Alexandra Park estate from Princess Road. Police in riot gear were greeted by missiles. That night, the police station in Greenhays Lane was besieged by up to 1,000 black and white youths. Shops were looted and vandalised as far away as Rusholme. The police disappeared. The next day they returned hard and heavy, determined not to abdicate control of the streets. More than 200 people were arrested. It was later held that the speed and aggression of the police response after the first night was instrumental in avoiding another Toxteth and in quelling the disturbances. The CID follow-up was first-rate, said Halligan. There were hundreds of people put before the courts. Some cops felt that their response to the riots had enhanced their power in the area, but it also destroyed their community links. After the riots, there was a distancing, said the DCI. They were patrolling by the police, but they weren't an intrusive and didn't get to know about as much. And I wonder if that allowed the gangs to flourish. There was also a lot about corruption, and then people began to assume you weren't bent if you went in the shebeens. One high-profile corruption case involved nearby Platt Lane police station. James Anderton, a puritanical, no-nonsense chief constable, also disbanded his vice squad after reports of some senior officers drinking after time in city pubs. The effect was that for 2 or 3 years after the riots, the CID lost touch with the streets. That was why Frank Halligan found the informant story so hard to swallow. These young gangs were a misery to him. But when the young man was able to put officers at the scene before several prearranged fights, Halligan came on board. It soon became clear that a major public order problem was brewing and that something had to be done. These gangs were the top for street disorder at the time, said the DCI. They were affecting the city. The two detectives and their boss had discovered that Manchester was in the opening stages of gang warfare, unlike anything it had known before. A conflict that would last for more than 20 years, cost dozens of lives, and leave hundreds injured. It would make headlines around the world, blight the reputation of one of Europe's most famous cities, and see the coining of the sinister and unwanted epithet, Gunchester. Yet, the officers and their colleagues knew nothing about it. It seemed to have come from nowhere.